Before the jungles burned and the skies filled with bombers, Vietnam was a land of quiet power, a narrow country of mountains, rivers, and seas. A land where legend and labor walked hand in hand. To the north, the Red River Delta spread like a green fan beneath the shadow of the mountains, a cradle of wet rice civilization older than many of the world's empires. Here, the people shaped their destiny through water, taming floods, building dikes, and worshipping the land that fed them. To the south lay the Mekong Delta, vast, fertile, and restless. Each season, its waters rose and fell, carving new paths through the mud and mangrove. For centuries, its people followed the rhythm of the monsoon, growing rice and stories in equal measure. Between these two great deltas stretched 1,000 miles of coastline. Beaches where fishermen cast their nets before dawn, where traders once brought silk from China and spices from Malacca. This was a land forged by endurance, a land that had learned, over 1,000 years of invasion and resistance, how to survive. For nearly a millennium, Vietnam had lived in the long shadow of China. Dynasty after dynasty ruled from the north, and yet the Vietnamese never forgot who they were. They absorbed their conquerors' ideas, their language, their philosophies, their systems of government, and then made them their own. From these centuries of struggle grew a national soul defined not by conquest, but by resilience. Vietnam did not build vast empires, it endured them. And when the age of Western imperialism dawned in the 19th century, that endurance would once again be tested. By the 1850s, the ships of France appeared on the horizon. Their hulls of iron and guns of steel glistened in the tropical sun. They came with missionaries and merchants, and with them, the certainty of European destiny. The French called it la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. They spoke of progress, of enlightenment, of roads and schools and order. But beneath that rhetoric lay a simpler motive, profit. The empire's hunger for land and resources would reshape the Vietnamese world. In 1887, France formally bound Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos into a single entity, l'Union Indochinoise, or French Indochina. It was to be the Pearl of the East, a colony to rival India or Java. Saigon became its showcase, a city of wide boulevards, cafes, and French villas, called the Paris of the Orient. But beyond the polished streets, the countryside told another story of debt, famine, and servitude. The French built plantations where Vietnamese peasants labored under foreign overseers. Rubber, coffee, and rice flowed out to Europe. Taxes rose, and hunger deepened. Entire families sold their labor for a handful of coins. The Vietnamese were forbidden to form political parties, restricted from higher education, and banned from holding most administrative posts. A handful of local collaborators, landlords and mandarins, grew rich serving French interests. For the rest, there was only silence. In the schools, children recited French history and geography, the Alps, the Seine, Napoleon, but learned little of their own kings or heroes. In the courts, a Frenchman's word outweighed that of any native. And on the walls of Saigon's grand hotels, signs warned, interdit auxiliary Annamites, no Vietnamese allowed. Yet no empire, however confident, can erase memory. In the countryside, stories of ancient resistance endured, of generals who had driven out Chinese armies, of farmers who fought invaders with bamboo spears. These tales were told quietly, under thatched roofs and moonlight, waiting for the day they might matter again. By the dawn of the 20th century, they began to matter indeed. The world was changing. Japan's victory over Russia in 1905 shattered the myth of European invincibility. If one Asian nation could defeat a Western power, why not another? Across Vietnam, whispers of reform grew into murmurs of rebellion. Students gathered in secret circles, pamphlets circulated under candlelight. Two men emerged as early voices of nationalism, Phan Bai Chao and Phan Chau Trinh. Phan Bai Chao believed independence could be won only through revolution and foreign alliances. He sought Japanese help, envisioning a modern, militarized Vietnam. Phan Chau Trinh, meanwhile, argued for education and gradual reform, a new Vietnam built through enlightenment, not arms. Both men would be arrested, exiled, and silenced, but their ideas would survive. Even within the colonial bureaucracy, a few idealists began to question France's right to rule. Vietnamese clerks, interpreters, and teachers saw the contradictions daily: liberty and equality preached, yet denied. In Paris, the world's powers spoke of self-determination and democracy. But in the villages of Indochina, peasants still bowed to their colonial masters. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. World War I brought new opportunities and new disillusionment. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese were sent to Europe as soldiers and laborers. They dug trenches in France, carried ammunition, and worked in factories. There, they saw a world beyond the colony, a world where ordinary men debated politics freely, where revolution and democracy were not just dreams. When they returned home, they carried those ideas with them like hidden weapons. The war that had been fought for the freedom of nations left Indochina unchanged, still ruled, still exploited, still voiceless. But in the aftermath, one young man in exile began to see a path forward, a man who would one day reshape Vietnam's destiny. His name was Nguyen Sinh Cung, though the world would come to know him as Ho Chi Minh. At the close of the Great War, Ho was in Paris, a dishwasher by day, a political activist by night. He wrote letters to the Allied leaders demanding independence for Vietnam, invoking the same principles they claimed to defend. No one answered. Disillusioned, he turned to socialism and communism, ideologies that promised liberation for the oppressed. In Moscow and later China, he studied revolution, organization, and propaganda. He became a man of many names and many disguises, but one purpose: freedom for Vietnam. By the time the world plunged again into war in 1939, Ho Chi Minh's dream was no longer a whisper in exile. It was a movement waiting to return home. The French Empire, confident and proud, would soon face its own collapse. The storm of global war was gathering once more, and in its chaos, the old order in Indochina would crumble. For the Vietnamese, the age of foreign masters was nearing its end. But before freedom came, there would be famine, fire, and betrayal. The fall of empire had begun. At the turn of the 20th century, the French colonial enterprise in Indochina appeared unshakable. It was an empire built on maps and illusions, the conviction that a distant European power could command the destinies of millions across oceans and centuries. Hanoi became its northern capital, Saigon its southern jewel. Between them stretched a chain of garrisons, plantations, and customs posts designed not only to extract wealth but to project grandeur. France saw in Vietnam a smaller reflection of itself, disciplined, cultured, and, above all, obedient. The administrators in their white linen suits wrote reports to Paris describing progress. Railways, they said, connected the deltas, telegraph wires hummed with modernity, education spread the French language to grateful subjects. Yet beneath this rhetoric of benevolence lay a rigid hierarchy sustained by fear and profit. The colonial economy revolved around extraction. Vietnam's rice fed Asia, its rubber and coal-filled French factories. By 1910, nearly every major industry belonged to French companies, and the profit seldom lingered on Vietnamese soil. Plantation owners grew rich, while peasants who once farmed their own fields now labored for foreign masters. The system produced what one French journalist called la grande misère, the great misery. Peasants worked 12-hour days in suffocating heat for wages too small to buy the rice they harvested. Taxes were collected with bayonets, and debt passed from father to son like an inheritance. French rule also reshaped society. The Catholic Church, protected by the state, expanded its influence, while Confucian scholars, once the pillars of Vietnamese learning, found themselves dismissed as relics. Traditional examinations were abolished, replaced by French curricula that extolled Paris, Napoleon, and the glory of empire. A new class emerged, les évolués, the evolved ones. Vietnamese educated in French schools, wearing European clothes, dreaming in a borrowed language. They staffed the lower ranks of government, serving as interpreters, clerks, and teachers, caught between admiration and resentment. To many of them, the promise of the Republic, liberty, equality, fraternity, rang hollow. They had learned its words but not its privileges. No matter how fluent their French, they remained outsiders in their own land. In Saigon, cafes filled with talk of Paris and progress, yet outside the city walls barefoot children begged in the dust. The contrast was impossible to ignore: modernity for a few, subjugation for the many. Even within the colonial administration, the myth of the civilizing mission began to crack. Reports from provincial officials spoke of corruption, of arbitrary arrests, of uprisings swiftly buried beneath official silence. But the empire, like all empires, survived on confidence. So long as the flag flew and the trains ran on time, Paris believed all was well. When war came to Europe in 1914, Indochina was called upon to serve the mother country. More than 90,000 Vietnamese were shipped to France as soldiers and laborers, digging trenches, driving trucks, manufacturing shells in the industrial heartland. For many, it was the first glimpse of another world. They saw French workers strike for wages, heard debates about socialism, and learned that liberty was not a gift bestowed by rulers but a right claimed by the people. Those ideas would not die when the war ended. The soldiers returned home with medals and disappointment. France thanked them with parades, then restored the old order as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The colony had glimpsed its master's vulnerability. In the aftermath of the Great War, Paris tightened control. Censorship increased, nationalist newspapers were banned. Yet the very act of suppression only spread the message further. For every pamphlet burned, another was copied in secret. By the 1920s, small underground groups sprouted across the country: teachers, railway workers, students, each seeking a way to resist. Some looked to Japan's modernization as a model, others to the democratic ideals professed by the West, still others to Marx and Lenin, whose words promised equality for the exploited. In the crowded alleys of Hanoi's old quarter, meetings were held behind shuttered doors. In Saigon's ports, dock workers whispered of strikes and sabotage. A revolution of thought had begun, even if few yet dared to name it. Among those who watched this ferment from afar was a thin, wandering Vietnamese who had spent years abroad under many names. In Paris, he had petitioned for independence at the Versailles Conference and been ignored. In Moscow, he had studied the science of revolution. His birth name was Nguyen Sin Kung. The world would come to know him as Ho Chi Minh. For Ho and his comrades, the French Empire was not invincible, it was brittle. It survived only so long as the people believed in its inevitability. If that illusion could be broken, the empire would collapse under its own weight. He began organizing cells of Vietnamese workers and students in France, forming the nucleus of what would become the Communist Party of Indochina. His writings circulated secretly back home, blending Marxist theory with patriotic appeal. Vietnam's struggle was both national and social, to free the country from foreigners and the poor from the rich. The French authorities branded him an agitator. Yet even in exile, his influence grew. By the 1930s, his ideas had reached every corner of the colony, from the plantations of Cochinchina to the highlands of Tonkin. Then, as Europe slid once more toward war, the cracks widened. The Great Depression devastated the colonial economy. Rice prices collapsed, famine stalked the deltas. Peasant revolts erupted across the countryside, brutally suppressed but never forgotten. In 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland, France again mobilized. In Indochina, conscription returned, and with it new resentment. The empire demanded loyalty but offered neither freedom nor security. And when France itself fell to Nazi Germany the following year, the illusion of permanence finally shattered. For the first time in 80 years, the rulers of Indochina were weaker than those they ruled. Japan moved swiftly to fill the vacuum, forcing the Vichy regime to surrender its colony in all but name. French officials remained in their offices, but their orders now came from Tokyo. Two empires shared one land, and the Vietnamese found themselves servants of both. The French Empire, stretched thin and humiliated, could no longer claim the mantle of civilization. Its authority had become a ghost of uniforms and decrees. And beneath that ghost, resistance awakened. In villages, teachers once loyal to France began hiding banned books. Peasants refused taxes. Secret committees formed in the hills. The long night of colonial rule was ending, not with diplomacy, but with hunger and war. Next, as the world descends into chaos, Japan tightens its grip, and the struggle for Vietnam's soul enters its most desperate hour. When Europe marched to war in 1914, the shock traveled farther than any cannon blast. In Indochina, the summons went out across rice fields and city streets alike. The empire needed men. They came by the tens of thousands. Some as soldiers in horizon blue, most as laborious in rough wool and borrowed boots, stevedores, machinists, carpenters, cooks. They boarded steamers in Haiphong and Saigon, their names crossed off ledgers kept in a language many could not read, and disappeared into the turbulent heart of France. In Picardy and Champagne they dug trenches through chalk and mud, in ports along the Atlantic they unloaded munitions by the ton, in factories near Paris they learned the rhythm of modern industry, the clang of presses, the hiss of steam, the whistle that divided life into shifts. For the first time, many Vietnamese saw a world where ordinary men argued openly about wages and rights, where newspapers criticized ministers, where the word citizen was spoken without irony. They tasted a freedom that had not been offered in their own country, and though most would return home, a part of them would remain forever changed. The Great War ended in victory parades and monuments, and in promises made from podiums. American President Woodrow Wilson spoke of self-determination. Europe's statesmen nodded gravely at phrases about the rights of nations. In a conference room at Versailles, the future seemed, for a moment, negotiable. Among the onlookers in Paris was a thin, earnest Vietnamese using a borrowed suit and a borrowed name, Nguyen Ari Kuk, Nguyen the Patriot. He submitted a petition for Vietnam's modest freedoms, representation, press rights, equality before the law. It was a document couched not in threats, but in the very language the Allies had used to justify their triumph. No one answered. The petition vanished into archives and ashtrays. Its author learned a lesson that would shape the century. If the colonized were to be free, eloquence would not be enough. Back in Indochina, the old order resumed with practiced certainty. The tricolour flew, the short kept its files, and taxes were collected with the same cold efficiency. But those who had seen France, who had heard trade unionists on soapboxes and read radical pamphlets in mess halls, could not unsee or unhear. The empire had summoned them to save it. It had also, unintentionally, taught them how to question it. The 1920s opened like a curtain on a new stage. The cafes of Hanoi's old quarter, the cool verandas of Saigon, the boarding rooms near provincial train stations, all became classrooms without walls. Ideas moved from hand to hand: nationalism, constitutional reform, socialism, the dream of a republic where Vietnamese would no longer need permission to be themselves. Underground presses rattled to life. Pamphlets recited natural rights, editorials mocked injustice, poems braided the language of love with the language of liberty. Teachers held night schools under oil lamps, workers formed mutual aid societies that were not yet unions but wished to be. The French administrators sensed the change. They extended schooling but tightened censorship. They reformed a regulation here and arrested a journalist there. A system that once felt effortless now required constant tending. In these years, opposition did not speak with one voice. Some sought gradual reform within French law, others placed their faith in modern education, still others concluded that only direct action would suffice. In 1930, officers of the Yen Bai garrison in the north, Vietnamese soldiers in the colonial army, mutinied, hoping to spark a wider revolt. It failed swiftly and bloodily, but it proved a vital point. Even those trained to defend the empire could imagine a world without it. Amid these cycles moved a man for whom defeat had been a tutor rather than a jailer. Nguyen Ari Kuk, the petitioner no one heard, had adopted another name and another task. He moved between Moscow and southern China, learning to weld politics to logistics, rhetoric to organization. Where others saw the empire as a wall, he studied it as a structure. Every structure has weaknesses, every weakness can be used. He was not alone. Across the colony, discrete networks crystallized, student circles that met to discuss forbidden books, railway crews who timed their grievances as carefully as a timetable, clerks who copied files twice, once for their superiors, once for the future. No single party yet owned the cause, but the cause was learning to own itself. French Indochina at the close of the 1930s was a paradox in sunlight. The governor's receptions glittered, Saigon cinemas premiered the latest reels, newspapers praised new roads and agricultural yields. And yet a single bad harvest could unravel entire districts, a single strike could paralyze a port, a single pamphlet could pass through 20 hands before morning. Then came the year that unstitched the seams of the old world, 1939. Germany invaded Poland, Europe was at war once more. France mobilized, conscription returned to Indochina, and fear, that patient ally of empire, resumed its work. Orders traveled outward from Paris, regulations multiplied, meetings were banned, presses seized, activists imprisoned. The short, cautious and methodical, believed that firmness would restore calm. It did not. It merely pressed discontent deeper, like embers buried in ash. In 1940, the blow fell. France itself collapsed under German attack, a new government at Vichy pledged cooperation with the conqueror, and in Indochina the colonial flag flew above offices whose instructions now came from strangers. Within months, another flag appeared, the sunburst of Imperial Japan, and with it the arithmetic of subjugation changed again. Two masters ruled one land. French administrators retained their desks and their pride, but the decisions that mattered were made in Tokyo. Japanese officers requisitioned rice, railways, and silence. The colony became a junction where empires exchanged orders. The Vietnamese became the messengers expected to obey them. The economy stretched like wire under a growing weight. Exports were commanded rather than negotiated, shortages foretold famine, the countryside felt itself yoked to appetites it did not share. When the monsoon failed, there was no margin. When one train was commandeered for troops, another could not carry grain. The mathematics of survival turned cruel. Yet in this tightening vice, an opportunity emerged for those who had learned to see cracks where others saw stone. If the colonizer now served a different colonizer, then the legitimacy of both could be questioned at once. The message that had long been whispered, that the empire was a costume and not a skin, found new listeners. The echoes of the Great War had begun as songs of sacrifice and victory. By the end of the 1930s they had become something else, instructions in how power works, and how it fails. Men who had shoveled snow from French platforms now shoveled rice from Vietnamese barns to Japanese boats and understood, with a clarity that needed no book, the true currency of empire. On the borders, another movement gathered its tools. In the mountains between Guangxi and Tonkin, messages crossed on mule tracks, in secret rooms, names were memorized and then forgotten, in camps that moved by night, a cadre drilled in both discipline and discretion. Their leader, the petitioner, the exile, the student of revolutions, was returning not as a supplicant but as an architect. What the Great War had taught him was simple, and it was devastating. Fine words do not liberate the conquered, organization does. An organization eats obstacles as hills eat fog. The stage was set for catastrophe and creation. With Europe in flames and Asia in chains, Vietnam would soon attempt what had seemed impossible, to tear the mask from empire in the very moment empire needed it most. But the price, when it came, would be paid first by the poor, in rice withdrawn, in fields untended, in the bitter arithmetic of famine. The war that had begun in Europe echoed now through 1,000 Vietnamese villages, not as gunfire but as silence at the bottom of an empty bowl. From that silence, a different sound would soon rise, the voice of a people who had learned to measure their rulers and found them wanting. Next, the occupation becomes a noose. Japan tightens its grip, French authority becomes a shadow, and a movement long in preparation steps from secrecy into history. Every revolution begins, in some measure, as a journey of an idea, a people, or a man. For Vietnam, that journey belonged to one who carried many names and one unwavering purpose, independence. He was born Nguyen Sinh Cung in 1890 in the village of Kim Lien, among rice paddies and red earth. His father, a scholar steeped in the old Confucian order, served briefly as an imperial official before resigning in protest against French dominance. From him, the boy inherited a sharp mind and a quiet defiance. As a child, he witnessed both the dignity and the futility of tradition. Vietnam's mandarins still wore their scholar robes, still bowed to a powerless emperor, still composed poetry about duty and virtue. But outside their gates stood soldiers with foreign rifles and flags that were not their own. By the time he was a young man, the world beyond the village had become irresistible. He left home to study, to teach, to see. He would never truly return. In 1911, he took a name from a teacher, Nguyen T. Ton, Nguyen the Accomplished, and found work as a kitchen helper on a French steamship. It was a simple act, unnoticed by those around him, yet it marked the first step of a pilgrimage that would last 3 decades and span 3 continents. The ship's voyage carried him to Africa, to Europe, and eventually to France itself. In Marseille, he saw the grand facade of empire, marble buildings, electric lights, and statues commemorating men who had conquered lands like his own. But behind that splendor, he saw poverty, hunger, and discontent, not among colonized laborers, but among the French poor. He cleaned tables in restaurants, swept floors, and listened. In the back rooms where dishwashers shared cigarettes, he heard talk of strikes and rights, of socialism and equality. These words took root in him like seeds blown on foreign wind. He began to write under various names, sending articles to newspapers that would publish them under Nguyen the Patriot, Nguyen Ari Kuk. He became a familiar figure in Paris's political cafes, quiet but intense, a man who asked questions no one expected from a colonial servant. In 1919, as the victors of the Great War assembled at Versailles, Nguyen Ari Kuk saw an opening. He drafted a petition addressed to the Allied leaders, demanding modest reforms for Vietnam, freedom of the press, representation in government, equality before the law. It was written in the very language of the French Revolution, invoking liberty, equality, and fraternity. The petition never reached its intended audience. But the act of writing it changed its author forever. He realized that empires do not yield to eloquence, only to pressure. From that point, the young man turned from reform to revolution. He attended political meetings, translated socialist pamphlets, and joined the French Communist Party, becoming its first Asian member. His colleagues saw in him both intellect and endurance. He saw in them both opportunity and contradiction. They spoke of freedom for workers but ignored the colonies that fed their industries. To Nguyen Ari Kuk, the solution was clear: communism could be the language of anti-imperialism. It offered a framework, organization, discipline, ideology that nationalism alone lacked. In 1923, he traveled to Moscow, drawn by the promise of the Soviet experiment. There, he studied at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East, where Lenin's words were treated as scripture and revolution as science. He learned how to form cells, how to operate clandestinely, how to turn suffering into strategy. Among his instructors and peers were future revolutionaries from China, India, and Africa. They debated tactics, translated manifestos, and planned movements that would one day shake half the world. But Nguyen Ari Kuk remained distinct. He was not only a student of Marx, he was a son of Vietnam. He argued that class struggle alone could not explain the colonial experience. The peasant, not the factory worker, was the true revolutionary in Asia. A people that had fought invaders for centuries needed nationalism as much as socialism. This synthesis of patriotism and ideology would become his hallmark. By the mid-1920s, he had moved again, this time to China. From the bustling streets of Canton, he began training Vietnamese exiles in revolutionary methods. He lectured in dimly lit rooms, using chalk to sketch the structure of a people's movement. He emphasized secrecy, unity, and discipline. The revolution must be as patient as the rice it grows. In 1930, after years of correspondence and cautious planning, he helped merge various nationalist factions into a single organization, the Communist Party of Vietnam. It was a fragile alliance, born in exile and hunted from the start. Yet it provided something Vietnam had never possessed, a political core that could outlast defeat. Almost immediately, the party faced its first test. That same year, uprisings erupted in Ngh and Hà Tnh at spontaneous, desperate revolts against colonial rule. The Communists lent support, but the French responded with overwhelming force. The revolts were crushed, and many leaders executed. Nguyen Ari Kuk himself was arrested in Hong Kong and narrowly escaped extradition. For several years, his trail goes dim, a fugitive passing through the shadowed corridors of empire. He lived under false names, evading spies and bounty hunters, writing pamphlets by candlelight, teaching where he could, and waiting for the world to shift again. It did in 1939, when the world returned to war. Germany invaded Poland, France mobilized, and across Asia, the rising empire of Japan prepared its expansion. In Indochina, the old colonial hierarchy began to wobble. The French demanded loyalty, even as their homeland fell. Japanese troops marched into Hanoi, and the tricolor was forced to share the wind with the rising sun. Nguyen Ari Kuk saw his moment approaching. He slipped back into southern China and resumed his work among exiles. He trained cadres not merely to agitate but to govern, to organize supply, administer justice, and command respect. Revolution, he said, is not a riot. It is an art. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, alliances around the world changed overnight. The Communists who had once been viewed as pariahs were now part of the Allied cause. For by now he was calling himself H. Chi Minh, he who enlightens, recognized the opportunity. If the Western powers could ally with Moscow against fascism, they might also tolerate Vietnamese communists who fought the Japanese. He returned to Vietnam that same year, crossing the border through the jungles of Cao Bng. After 3 decades abroad, the man once called Nguyen Sin Kung came home as H. Chi Minh, leader, strategist, and symbol. In mountain villages, he met peasants who had never seen a foreigner, much less a revolutionary. He wore a simple khaki outfit, ate their food, and spoke softly. He taught literacy, distributed captured rice, and spoke of independence as if it were as practical as planting a field. Under his direction, the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam, was formally established in May 1941. It united nationalists, peasants, and communists under a single banner: resist the Japanese, overthrow the colonialists, and build a free Vietnam. The Viet Minh began as a handful of men in the highlands. By war's end, it would command tens of thousands. When the storms of World War II spread across Asia, they reached even the rice fields of Indochina. By 1940, France had fallen to Nazi Germany, and its empire was suddenly without a master. In that moment of confusion, Japan stepped forward to claim its place. The Japanese called their empire the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a promise of liberation from Western colonialism. But for the people of Vietnam, it would bring only another kind of bondage. At first, Japanese troops entered Indochina under a polite fiction: the French colonial administration would remain in charge, maintaining order in the name of Vichy France. In truth, every decision of consequence flowed from Tokyo. French officials continued to wear their uniforms, to sit at their desks, to issue decrees stamped with familiar seals. But the illusion was thin. Japanese soldiers patrolled the streets, Japanese requisition officers took what they pleased. The colony became a puppet held by two strings, one painted blue, white, and red, the other red and white with a rising sun. For the Vietnamese, it was a time of contradictions. Two foreign flags flew overhead, neither spoke for the people who lived below them. Japan's primary need was rice, food for its army and its homeland. At gunpoint, farmers were ordered to deliver their harvests to government depots. French administrators, eager to preserve their own privileges, enforced these orders with ruthless efficiency. In the northern provinces, the situation turned catastrophic. Floods destroyed fields, transportation broke down as rails and barges were commandeered for military use. The colonial system, designed for export rather than survival, offered no cushion. When famine came in 1944, it struck with biblical cruelty. Villages emptied. Families sold their homes, their tools, their clothing, anything that could buy a handful of grain. Those who could walk drifted south along the roads like ghosts. Those who could not were buried in the fields where they fell. In some districts, people stripped bark from trees, boiled leaves, and ground grass into paste. Rice that once filled warehouses for export now rotted behind guarded doors. Between late 1944 and mid-1945, historians estimate that 2 million Vietnamese, perhaps more, died of hunger. The number is so vast it defies imagination. In some villages, entire family lines disappeared. The French blamed the Japanese blamed the weather. For the peasants who starved, blame was meaningless. They saw only that both occupiers had taken their food and offered nothing in return. The famine broke something in the colonial psyche. The idea that foreign rulers brought order and progress could not survive the sight of mothers burying their children in the same soil they had tilled for empire. While the countryside starved, new movements stirred in the mountains. The Viet Minh, under H. Chi Minh's direction, seized the moment. They distributed what little rice they could seize from Japanese stores and local landlords. To the desperate, they seemed the only force that cared whether they lived or died. The Viet Minh's methods were simple but effective. Every sack of grain they shared was stamped with their message of independence. Every village meeting was both relief effort and recruitment drive. Hunger, which had once sustained obedience, now fed rebellion. By 1945, their network reached deep into the countryside. Cadres established committees to manage food distribution, repair irrigation, and maintain security. The Viet Minh were not merely guerrillas, they were becoming a government in waiting. Across Indochina, other nationalist factions existed, some backed by China, others by Japan itself, but none matched the Viet Minh's discipline or reach. They drew strength not from ideology alone, but from credibility earned in crisis. Every revolution is, at its heart, an answer to suffering. And in that terrible famine, the answer bore a red flag. Japan's position in Indochina grew increasingly desperate as the war turned against it. Allied forces were advancing across the Pacific, supply lines frayed. The Japanese High Command began to suspect that France's colonial officials, nominal allies, might betray them if given the chance. On the 9th of March, 1945, they acted. In a swift and brutal coup, Japanese troops surrounded French garrisons across the colony. Officers were seized in their quarters, some executed on the spot. Within 48 hours, the entire French military presence in Indochina ceased to exist. The colonial governor, Admiral de Coup, was placed under arrest. Japanese propaganda declared the birth of an independent Vietnam under Emperor Bo Dai, a monarch resurrected as figurehead. It was independence in name only. Japanese officers now ruled directly through local intermediaries, dictating policy from Hanoi. To the Vietnamese, it was yet another mask of empire. But masks can slip. By mid-1945, Japan's own defeat was inevitable. American bombers darkened its skies, its navy lay shattered, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were only weeks away. As the empire crumbled, its soldiers in Indochina turned inward, hoarding supplies, guarding depots, and defending their positions against imaginary invasions. Order dissolved into chaos. In that confusion, the Viet Minh moved. They struck railways, seized towns, and captured armories abandoned by retreating forces. They proclaimed local governments in liberated zones, raised red and gold flags, and distributed food from seized warehouses. In that moment, centuries of subjugation seemed to end. The crowd wept, cheered, and believed. Yet as H's voice carried over the square, far beyond it, new forces were already moving, Allied armies landing to disarm the Japanese, Chinese troops entering from the north, British and French returning to the south. The revolution's dawn would be brief. Still, for one radiant morning, the Vietnamese believed themselves free. And in their hearts, that belief became fact, something no empire would ever again erase. The long night of occupation was over, but the long war for independence was only beginning. Next, the French return, bearing flags, vengeance, and a conviction that history could be undone. The First Indochina War begins. By mid-1945, the great empires of Asia lay in ruins. Japan's armies, once unstoppable, now retreated across the continent. Its generals spoke of honor, its soldiers spoke of survival. And in Vietnam, after decades of foreign rule, power hung in the air, waiting to be claimed. For the first time in a century, the old order was gone. The French had been humiliated, the Japanese disarmed, and the Allies still far away. In the chaos between surrender and occupation, a single movement, disciplined, organized, and ready, stepped forward, the Viet Minh. Chi Minh and his comrades had spent years preparing for this moment. They had learned patience from their defeats, strength from their hunger, and unity from their suffering. Now, they would learn how to govern. On the evening of August 13, 1945, a secret meeting convened in the northern mountains. Around a flickering oil lamp, the Central Committee of the Communist Party decided the time had come. The order was simple: TNG Ki Nga, general uprising. Messengers raced through villages, carrying handwritten instructions. Cadres whispered the code words in markets and pagodas. Within days, the signal spread across the countryside like electricity through wire. From August 14 onward, towns and cities erupted in motion. In the north, peasants seized district offices, tore down Japanese banners, and hoisted the red flag with its gold star. In central Vietnam, demonstrations filled the streets. In the south, students and workers occupied police stations and armories. Everywhere, the cry was the same: Vietnam CLP. Vietnam independence. The uprising moved not as an army but as a tide. In some towns, Japanese troops looked on, bewildered, in others, local garrisons surrendered without a fight. The French were nowhere to be seen, imprisoned, disarmed, or in hiding. The colonial machine had finally stopped. What followed was less a battle than an awakening. For the first time, the people themselves took possession of the machinery of their own state. They formed people's committees to restore order, distribute food, and organize local defense. Village elders, teachers, monks, and former soldiers worked side by side. Across the nation, red and gold flags appeared overnight, sewn from cloth, painted on bedsheets raised on bamboo poles. Children marched with makeshift drums, women cooked for volunteers, scribes wrote proclamations in trembling handwriting. It was a revolution carried not by armies, but by the will of millions. In the imperial city of Hu, the revolution reached its symbolic heart. Emperor Bo Dai, descendant of 1,000 years of monarchy, realized the old world was gone. On August 25, he summoned representatives of the Viet Minh and handed them his imperial seal and sword, the emblems of dynastic power. He declared, "I would rather be a citizen of an independent country than emperor of a slave nation." With those words, the Nguyen dynasty and nearly 2,000 years of monarchy came to an end. It was a peaceful abdication, but a monumental one. For the first time since the days of myth, Vietnam had no king, only its people. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, preparations began for the birth of a new nation. The streets buzzed with anticipation. Crowds gathered outside the former French governor's palace, now under Viet Minh control. Banners declared the CLP Hay La CHT. Independence or death. H. Chi Minh, frail from illness and exhaustion, worked late into the night with his closest advisers drafting the document that would define the nation's rebirth, the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He drew upon familiar words, deliberately echoing the principles of the American and French revolutions, the very ideals used to justify colonial domination. By turning them back upon their authors, H transformed hypocrisy into history's weapon. The text was written in simple Vietnamese, clear and poetic. It spoke of suffering, of resistance, of the right of a people to govern themselves. It promised equality, freedom of belief, and an end to exploitation. To those who had endured famine and fear, it was more than politics, it was poetry. On the morning of September 2, 1945, an estimated 500,000 people filled Ba Đình Square in Hanoi. The air shimmered with heat and anticipation. Banners waved, children perched on rooftops, and veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers. At precisely 2 o'clock, H. Chi Minh appeared. He wore his plain khaki uniform, his thin frame and white beard visible even from a distance. He waited for the crowd to quiet, then began to speak. "All men are created equal," he read, his voice firm but weary. "They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The crowd erupted, a sea of cheers and tears. For those who had known nothing but occupation, the words were almost sacred. H continued, his tone steady, his phrasing deliberate. "The whole Vietnamese people, animated by a common resolve, are determined to fight for their freedom and independence." When he finished, there was silence, then thunderous applause. In that silence, Vietnam became a nation again. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the struggle was over. Farmers returned to their fields, students to their classrooms. In villages, people hung red flags from doorways and sang songs of unity. In Hanoi, committees worked to reopen schools, distribute land, and collect weapons. The new government faced impossible odds, famine still raged, infrastructure was broken, and the Allies were on their way. Yet there was a fragile hope, a belief that perhaps the world would recognize this rebirth. After all, the Allies had fought a war for freedom, had they not? Surely they would honor those same principles in Asia. But hope is often the first casualty of victory. As the ink dried on HS Declaration, ships were already docking in southern ports. British troops arrived in Saigon to disarm the Japanese, and with them came French officers, eager to reclaim their lost colony. To the north, Chinese nationalist forces poured across the border under Allied orders, ostensibly to restore order, but in truth to plunder whatever remained. Vietnam's independence, declared so proudly, was already under siege. The French, humiliated by war and occupation, saw in Indochina a chance to reclaim their honor. They spoke not of empire, but of restoration, of civilization, of the natural order of things. For them, H. Chi Minh's declaration was a temporary embarrassment, a local disturbance to be corrected. By late 1945, the country was once again divided, not by geography, but by the will of foreign armies. In Hanoi, H. Chi Minh's government struggled to maintain authority amid shortages and political intrigue. In Saigon, French and British forces fought local militias in the streets, bombing and shelling entire neighborhoods. In the countryside, the people who had cheered independence now dug shelters once more. The revolution had given birth to a republic, but that republic was born surrounded by enemies. And so, even before it could draw its first full breath, Vietnam found itself back at war. The August Revolution was, in truth, both an ending and a beginning. It ended nearly a century of foreign colonial rule, but it began 30 years of unbroken conflict. To the Vietnamese, the struggle for freedom had ceased to be a chapter in history, it had become history itself. Next, the French return. Gunboats on the Saigon River, paratroopers over Hanoi, and the first shots of a new war, the First Indochina War. In the autumn of 1945, the flags of empire came down, but their shadows remained. For a moment, Vietnam stood in the light of its own making, a nation reborn from famine and faith. Yet around it, the world of victors was already dividing. Old powers sought to reclaim their colonies, new ones sought to define their influence. The dream of independence, so newly spoken in Hanoi, was caught between them, between ideologies and interests that saw Southeast Asia not as a home, but as a chessboard. For France, Indochina was to be restored, a proof that defeat in Europe had not meant the end of empire. For the United States and its allies, the region was a frontier in a new and unspoken war, the Cold War, where every struggle for freedom was measured by its alignment. And for the Vietnamese people, who had endured conquest, occupation, and hunger, there was only one truth left to learn, that independence won on paper must be defended in blood. In the months to come, the streets of Saigon would echo with gunfire. French troops would return beneath their tricolour, convinced they could rebuild what history had already buried. Villages that had raised the flag of the Viet Minh would once again burn. The era of colonies was ending, but the age of wars for their remains was just beginning. In Paris, politicians spoke of missions and mandates. In Hanoi, H. Chi Minh spoke of peace and reason. Neither would prevail. For Vietnam, the fall of empire was not a conclusion, it was the opening of a new struggle that would define a century. Next time, on Vietnam War Perspective. The tricolour returns to Saigon, The first shots are fired in Hanoi, and a nation that refuses to kneel learns that freedom must fight for itself.